Hi, Penny.
Good evening.
I was wanted to ask you, how is your daughter doing? There was some skin issue that Emma
Oh,
had?
she had some moles that were suspicious,
Yes.
and so she's had 5 or 6 surgeries this year to remove them. She's doing well now.
Good.
The last reports were clear that
Good.
there's nothing else suspicious at this point, but it's something that she's going to have to keep an eye on and monitor.
Yeah.
So she's doing well now, and she has found a job that she absolutely loves, and they love her there. So that's, she's been there 7 months, and she just adores. She works for Sunrise Senior Living.
Yes.
She's at the one that's there by Fort Belvoir. It's called the Sunrise at Belvoir Woods, and it's military officers, retired military officers.
Yes.
And so she's the recreation assistant there. She's having a great time. She teaches craft classes. She says she gets her grandma and grandpa experience every day.
Well,
So
we need more people like her. We old folks do.
Well, as I've now joined the ranks of we old folks, it's nice. Although I haven't retired yet. I'm still working full time, so.
Well, it's highly recommended, at least from this direction anyway.
It's my mother used to say after she had retired, she says, I don't know how I had time to work. She was as busy in retirement as she ever was when she was working. So
I think my mother said the same thing.
yeah. And it's all in how you approach it. I'm sure there's going to be plenty to keep me busy.
Okay, there you go. I'm gonna,
Hi all.
Hello.
After you come back, I will probably be joining him. And will be able to,
You're gonna be on
In
Zoom?
December.
no,
In December.
After, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. All right,
See you
thanks,
guys
Bob.
later.
Yep.
Bye, Bob. Hi to Ann.
I will.
Minutes.
Well, since the football game's on, I'm going to mute myself now.
I don't keep up with football.
Good, tough day. You're gonna watch this Steve Freeman or football? Steve Freeman or
Who's
football?
playing? The Washington football team?
Hey, Washington's over. They won. They beat Tampa Bay.
Oh, really?
I'm not even watching it, and I haven't been. But it's on in the other room, and I don't have, my headphones aren't working, so.
Oh,
There you go.
okay. All right. Well, this is way more interesting than football,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely. For me.
Anybody?
Depends on whether you're a football player.
It is.
Less commercials.
Yeah.
There are no commercials. This is
Doesn't matter.
commercial free right here. Commercial free. There's a lot of commercials in football.
There are.
Are
There's
they?
a lot of commercials in broadcast TV.
Period.
It just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
Best sport to watch commercial wise is hockey.
Yeah.
Hmm.
They still have 2 TV timeouts per period.
3,
Is it
but they're
3?
exactly 2 minutes long.
Oh, goodness.
4
Well-
commercials, it's done.
That still says.
We went
six.
to the
That was
Army
6,
Navy
6.
game a few years ago when it was up in Philadelphia. And the timeouts there, I mean, they would, when there was a timeout, a TV timeout, some guy out on the field would pull up a sign, 2.5 minutes, and it would count down.
Huh.
And whenever that sign went up 2.5, you could hear the crowd would groan. They just go, oh.
Because it's
It
freezing
seems
there
like
anyway.
forever,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, those games. Oof.
All right.
Cold.
Well, I think it's time, so let's go ahead and get started. So greetings, everyone here at Messiah, those out in Zoom land. Glad to see everyone again. I think we've got almost everybody here. I know Paul is not here tonight. They're traveling. But
Baptism
here
of a
first.
grandbaby, I think.
yes,
He wasn't here for the Sunday school classes. Yeah.
I think that's why.
but we're here tonight to talk Proverbs. So we'll get into Proverbs in just a minute. We're going to do the whole book in 1 hour. We'll try to anyway. Let me just open us in prayer. Dear Father, thank you for bringing us together again this night, study your word. We just pray, Lord, that you give all of us the wisdom and the insight to try to understand the words here that you have inspired to be written. That you help us to understand your word and to grow in our faith. We thank you and praise you for your word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so Proverbs. Proverbs is basically a book about finding godly wisdom for living. That's what it's about. It's all about wisdom. If there ever were a wisdom book, Proverbs is supposed to be the wisdom book. So I looked up wisdom just to see, well, what is the classic definition of wisdom? Because people think of wisdom just meaning smart. It's more than that. So what I found in the dictionary is it's a knowledge of what is true or right, coupled with just judgment as to actions. Knowledge of what is true and right, coupled with just judgment as to action. And when I was thinking about that definition a little bit, you know, that this verse from Ephesians came into my mind. Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love. Right? Isn't that a short summary of wisdom? New Testament version, thanks to the Apostle Paul. If Psalms is said to be the go-to book when you're hurting, Proverbs is the how-to book. It's the essence of Israel's wisdom. Wisdom is a word mentioned 41 times throughout the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is a collection of collections. No one person sat down and put pen to paper and wrote all 30-some books of Proverbs. Just like Psalms, we know that they were collected, they were random, they were collected, they were put together in 5 sub-books of the Psalms. Same thing with the Proverbs. And the kind of disjointed structure of the Proverbs suggests that they sort of grab here, grab there, just threw them together, and there you go. They consist, for the most part, of short 1, 2, or 3 sentence sayings that express truth about human behavior. But honestly, I think they often sound more like folk wisdom than they do Holy Scripture. And maybe that's the reason that we don't talk about Proverbs so much in the church today, as we do Psalms or some of the other books of the Bible. They seem not necessarily, in my mind anyway, to pack the sort of spiritual or emotional weight that you get from some of the other books of the Bible. They mention God in there. God is mentioned, but it's a book. It's not like God is actually speaking, or someone is speaking to God, or praying to God, or lamenting to God, as they are in the Psalm. So it's a little bit different sort of animal. It's difficult to summarize. There's no particular plot or storyline, no named characters, disorderly, disjointed in its organization. Some of it actually can sound rather harsh and non-PC by today's standards. And it seems to be, as I said, rarely cited in our liturgies or sermons. Yet much of its wisdom in there, I think, is truly timeless. Again, it was written in ancient times, but much of what's in there just goes to the truth of human behavior and human character.
It's kind of like a book of morality.
Book of
You know,
morality.
how to behave yourself. And Solomon, I mean, really, Solomon is giving these instructions to his sons. And he's telling them how to behave. You're going to be, you know, men, this is how we behave. This is how we go about doing things. And probably. But, you know, women were property. We had no.
So we're gonna get right into that here. Actually, that leads into my next point, that there are some problematic aspects of the Proverbs. One of them I was reading about is that it is very patriarchal. It is really written primarily for young men, or so it would seem. And the first 5 chapters of Proverbs are all my son, my son, my son, my son. So as you say, it is about the king or the author or some woman giving guidance or advice to a young man on the verge, someone on the verge of manhood. And so, you know, there's some concern that it really is very patriarchal. It is in some places, it's harsh on women, but you can argue it's harsh on everybody too. So
But you have to put that in perspective.
Right.
The entire culture was patriarchal.
Right.
There is no way that whoever wrote this down in this period of time could have written something that was not patriarchal.
Right.
And so it falls to us to translate that son to daughter or son to offspring. I don't think literally. I think when you start doing that literally in the Bible, it ruins the Bible. But you have to understand, that's really talking about today, all our projects, not just one.
So there are a couple of other potentially problematic things about the Proverbs. One is some of the Proverbs you might read, and we'll get to a couple as we go through them, that you look at and you say, well, it's just not right. I don't agree with that. And the other thing that commonly comes up in reading the Proverbs is that there appear to be a lot of contradictions in the Proverbs. One proverb will contradict another proverb, in one case back to back. And that tends to throw people for a bit of a loop. But the important thing, there's two important things I think to remember here when we're looking at the Psalms. One is in terms of, you know, things that don't make sense or don't seem right or don't match up with their own life experience. Proverbs is not promises. Proverbs is about probabilities, and that's on that little handout, the attachment that I sent out this week. It's about probabilities. It's telling you that if you behave in a certain way, there's a strong likelihood that this goodness will follow. But it's not a promise that it will follow, and we know it's not a promise because in our own lives, we try to live as best we can, good, righteous lives, and still bad things happen. So there's no guarantees, even in the Christian community, that nothing bad is ever going to happen. So Proverbs, again, while it tends to be a little formulaic, a little too formulaic if you read it so literally, but it's probabilities, not promises. And the other aspect of it on the contradiction part, and we'll see some contradictions in here. Those contradictions are situationally dependent. They're situationally dependent. You have to look at them in terms of the context in which that bit of wisdom is being given, and in the context of which that other bit of wisdom is being given that resembles the first but seems to contradict it. And part of the problem we have is we don't always know, well, we don't know the context for these sayings. We don't know what motivated some wise man who contributed to the Proverbs to say this or to say that. We don't know the context, but you have to think of it in terms of being situational. You know, sort of in terms of like a modern day expression, look before you leap. But he who hesitates is lost. So there's a contradiction, right? But it's situational, right? It depends on what the situation is. And I think the same thing is true with the Proverbs. So I guess bottom line with the Proverbs is we got to be careful when we're reading them. And I think that we have to see the forest for the trees. We have to look at them in their totality and what they're telling them, what some of the life lessons are there in a general sense that we're seeing. And even though it's not God, doesn't seem to be God speaking directly as God was in the previous books that we read, I think that together the Proverbs will reveal the character of God. And I believe that they are consistent with what came before them and what comes after them in the New Testament for the most part. All right, so the author. Who's the primary author?
Depends on the section.
So,
Solomon.
Solomon for the first 10.
No, the answer is we don't know.
Attributed to Solomon.
Attributed to. Yeah. Really, scholars, you know, I never knew so much about scholars until I had to get prepared for this course. And I had no idea how
They
deeply
dig
they
into
look in
everything.
and dig at all these things and they, you know. But I mean, the bottom line, like any of the books in the Old Testament, we don't know for sure who wrote them. But King Solomon is definitely credited as the principal author in the Proverbs themselves, right? He is listed as the author. for most 27 of the 31 chapters of the Psalms, of the Proverbs. And it's not, it's logical to think that he was the author of many of the Proverbs that are in there. In 1 Kings, we find that Solomon was said to have written 3,000 Proverbs and 1,005 songs. Now, it doesn't say 1,000 songs or about it, it said 1,005 songs. That specificity, I think, is very interesting, but 3,000 Proverbs. So in Kings, a whole separate book talks about how he liked to write Proverbs.
And also, when God asked him what he wanted, he said he wanted wisdom. That's
Right.
what he chose. So again, you think, well, these wisdom things are from Solomon.
Right, right. Thank you
Again,
again for a
inspired
lead in.
by God.
You have my talking. You stole it.
I stole it.
I didn't do that. Okay, no, that's great.
Of course,
In
I
first,
can't-
go ahead.
I said, of course, I can't read.
Well, that's a minor. point.
Absorbed a lot.
No, in 1 Kings, it talks about a dream that Solomon had just after he became the king. He was the second son of David and Bathsheba. He became king after a dispute with his brother, who he killed. But those were different times. He became king, and God obviously favored him and wanted him to be king of Israel, according to the Old Testament writings. So after he became king, early on, he fell asleep, he had a dream, and God came to him and said, "What do you want? I'll give you anything you want," which was kind of a test. And Solomon answered correctly. He said, "I want a discerning heart to govern your people and distinguish between right and wrong."
So what about the commandment, thou shalt not kill, and then give the guy who kills his brother,
It's,
the king,
thou shalt not murder.
whatever, he murdered him. So, and then God turns around and gives him
But
this.
that's not the
right.
only Old Testament.
I know, they're all of them murdering their brothers, and you know, what is this,
Well-
fratricide is okay?
It's interesting because some of the proverbs in here talk disparagingly about brothers. They elevate friends and put down brothers. I thought that was very interesting.
I don't know. I know
I
that-
think there was a lot of competition.
Well, there was, because the first son was always favored.
Yeah,
And
right.
so there was a lot of that.
Look
with
at
the
Joseph
second
and his
son.
brothers.
David's kids killed each other.
Right,
Yeah,
Right.
you know,
And the mothers often encouraged them.
Mm.
Because, they had all these other mothers. They didn't all have the same mother.
I don't know. It just, there was a lot of bad stuff.
so
going on.
the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this and said, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth, nor have asked for the death of your enemies,
He could have asked for being.
but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked." And talks to him and said, "I will give you a wise and discerning heart. There will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever anyone be." Whoa, pretty strong words there, right? So that was in his dream. And then later on in 1 Kings, it talks about his wisdom. God gave Solomon wisdom, very great insight, a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Wisdom greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt, which was a potential enemy, wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, so forth and so on. So he was indeed blessed with wisdom. And one of the reasons that scholars challenge whether
Another problem with this, Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat and gain wisdom. So now God gives Solomon all this wisdom.
well, it was wisdom to rule the kingdom the way God would have him.
Adam
rule.
and Eve were pursuing the knowledge of good and evil, which is not
All right.
wisdom necessarily.
I still think giving any man too much wisdom would be counterproductive. for God.
Too much
Because
wisdom.
they're gonna turn it around somehow. Sure, sure, always. What did the Jews always do? Mess up again. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm
Okay.
very negative tonight.
That's all right. That's good. I like it. I like
Bringing out the
negative.
worst in
I
her
think
tonight.
people just as soon you get it out of your system.
So I don't beat on you
Deal with it
tonight.
tomorrow.
Yeah, you guys can hear it.
Okay, so we accept Solomon was really a wise guy, all right? In a good sense, in a good sense.
Use Italian.
He was a wise guy, all right? But some scholars have argued that in the ancient times, when they attributed works of the Old Testament or the Tanakh to different authors, didn't necessarily mean that they wrote it. It means that, it was in the sort of the spirit of. So for example, Moses is credited with having written the first 5 books of the Torah. We don't know that.
You weren't in
But
the
he
Sunday
was the
school.
personification of the law.
You missed my Sunday school.
Yeah, Sunday school
sorry.
class this morning, we talked about that.
Okay. David was seen as the personification of the Psalms, and then
Yeah.
Solomon, of course, was wisdom. So therefore, he must have, he was credited with having written these books, not just Proverbs, but also the 2 to follow, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, which we'll talk about whether he was really the author of those or not as well. Anyway, bottom line is there's doubt that he necessarily was the author, but for the sake of our discussion tonight, let's just assume that he was and go forward, not get too wrapped up around that. Yeah, it's interesting, one thing about Solomon. And scholars cannot prove that Solomon actually lived. There's no clear, specific archaeological or other evidence that he actually lived. I was watching a video on this last night. And there are some artifacts that suggest maybe sort of could have, but it's not definitive. But I do note that Jesus himself mentioned Solomon a couple of times. In Matthew 6:29, he says, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these lilies. And then in Matthew 12:42, it says, now one greater than Solomon is here, right? So, that Jesus would reference Solomon, and Jesus was God, and Jesus was the creator, would have been the creator of Solomon, like everybody else, through whom all things were made. So that gives me greater credibility, I think, the idea that Solomon lived and was as he is depicted here in the Old Testament. All right, quickly, a few other authors. If we'll just take it on faith that he was the author as is listed in here for the sake of discussion anyway. Parts of 3 later chapters are attributed to, quote, sayings of the wise. We don't know who they are. They were wise sages of some kind at that time. Really don't know anything else about who they might have been. One chapter, Proverbs 30, which is kind of an interesting chapter, is attributed to an individual named Agur, H-E-U-R, who, according to my research, was a non-Israelite sage from northern Arabia, but otherwise unknown. And then the last book of, or the chapter of Proverbs, Proverbs 31, was written by a King Lemuel, thought to be of Massa, which was an area in what is today the Arabian Peninsula, renowned for its wisdom. And his name means devoted to God. But yeah, interestingly enough, apparently some of what they put down from King Lemuel was in Aramaic, the Aramaic language, and not in the Hebrew language, suggesting that he was clearly not Hebrew. He was from outside Israel, somewhere in the Near East. So those are the attributed authors in the book. The dating of the book, well, Solomon's rule, he ruled for 40 years in the 10th century BC. Specifically, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I found 971 to 931 BC. So he lived in the 900 BC era. So if he was the author, that's when the majority of the Psalms would have been written. It was a good time for psalm writing because that was the time when the northern and southern kingdom had not split. They were unified. It was one state, Israel. And thanks to the conquests of King David and some other peace treaties that he and then later Solomon made, it was a time of peace. Israel was not threatened with attack from the outside during his reign. So you can conjecture that maybe this was a good time for kings to sit back and think great thoughts and have the time to write 3,000 Proverbs and 1,005 Psalms. The Proverbs 22 to 24, these are the ones that are in the, called of the sayings of the wise. Interestingly enough, they are said to be similar, if not almost identical in some places, to 30 sections of an Egyptian wisdom textbook, which was known as a book, the title of which was Wisdom of Amenemope. It was an instructional piece contemporary with the Rule of Solomon. And scholarly consensus is that the two works are related, the sayings of the wise and this Egyptian book, which is not really surprising because we know that the other cultures around Israel certainly had an influence on the thinking of the Hebrew nation. And there was some things we've seen that appears that they did enter into some of the writings in the Old Testament as well. And then chapters 25 to 29, which are called in the Bible more Proverbs of Solomon. A superscription says this section was compiled during the reign of King Hezekiah, 756 to 686. This was a time of spiritual renewal just after the Assyrians had come in and conquered the northern kingdom and hauled off the Jews who lived there. And so he was the ruler of what was left, the southern kingdom, or Judah. And he, during a time of spiritual renewal, ordered that more Proverbs of Solomon be put together and edited. So that's where they are thought to have been, not written necessarily in that time, but consolidated and edited. We've already talked about the audience a little bit. Really, I mean, if you strip out the gender issue here, I mean, wisdom is wisdom. It applies to everybody. It's not just young men, although some of the things in there seem specifically aimed at them. There are no characters, there's no story, no plot line. It's all random little bits of wisdom, all scattered shot. No particular order, no thread. The only characters in there are individuals named the wicked, fools, sluggards, adulterers, mockers, the poor, the rich, the wise. Okay, so those are the main.
Covers us all.
Right, here we go. All right. So the content and the structure, we've talked about this a little bit already, but it's divided into 6 parts, 31 chapters, 26 from Solomon, portions of 5 from the other wise men. So it starts off with a prologue, which we're going to look at parts of because I think it's very important. And then the Proverbs of Solomon, those are chapters 1 to 22. Then we, put Solomon on the back burner, and it introduces sayings of the wise, which are 3 chapters, 22 to 24, parts of them. Then further sayings of the wise concludes chapter 24. Then back to Proverbs of Solomon, then sayings of Agur, then sayings of King Lemuel. Okay, so who edited this thing?
I don't know.
I don't know. Ancient editors left something to be desired. Yes.
I just said God edited it. I believe that whatever is in the Bible, God did inspire and intended it to be there. So I don't question who wrote it or,
That's a good answer. That's consistent with the Methodist faith. Divinely inspired,
right.
right? Okay, good.
But we could organize it better.
Well,
I don't know.
That's good. Let's improve the
Put
Bible.
things together.
Do that between now and 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
right.
Yeah, I'll do that. for you.
All right, so now we're going to fly through the Proverbs here, and as we go through these kind of quickly here, because there's 30 chapters. If you see a proverb, that you want to bring out, talk about, mention, please just stop me, and we'll stop and we'll look at that for a minute, because I've got a few that I want to highlight as well when we go through. So, beginning with the first chapter, the prologue. The first 9 chapters, actually, the thinking is that they were added later by an editor. Some editor decided to write that and stick it on at the front of all the other wise little sayings to make sort of an introduction into what was to come. So the purpose of the Proverbs is articulated in black and white right there in chapter 1, verse 2. For attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right, just, and fair, giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. And then we skip down to verse 7, where it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. Does that sound like we've heard that anywhere before? Where? fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. In Psalms, chapter 1, right, or Psalm 1, where it talks about the wicked and the righteous. And in Job too. If you may recall that chapter 28, I think it was in the book of Job, where it says, where can wisdom be found? Wisdom can only be found from God. God has to give wisdom. All right, so then we begin this exhortation to embrace wisdom, and off we go. We look at, I talked about some of these things may not seem right to us today.
In chapter 2, there's an interesting piece that flies in the face of our concept of patriarchy.
What's that?
My son, hear the instructions of your father, and do not reject the teachings of your
Ah,
mother.
yes, right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it says that in a couple of places.
Okay,
Some others might know it.
now, chapter 2 there, the beginning of chapter 2, since you went there, talks about where do you get wisdom? Again, you ask for it. You ask for it from God, and God gives wisdom, right? We go over to chapter 3, further benefits of wisdom. We go down to verse 5 and 6. Those are maybe the two most commonly known of the Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. What might that be a summary of? Something we've already discussed. Trust in the Lord, lean not on your own understanding. All your ways acknowledge him, he will make your path straight. Any thoughts about out in Zoom land?
They all asleep.
They're all
Wake up out
muted.
there.
I think it sounds like a perfect summary for the book of Job. Just trust God. Don't try to figure him out. Acknowledge him, which Job did faithfully. Continue to acknowledge Job. And in the end, God did make his path straight.
It's one of my personal favorite Proverbs, just because it's one of the first ones I learned by heart as part of an organization I belonged to when I was a younger woman. And it just means a lot. You know, that's the sum of faith right there. Trust in the Lord. Don't lean on your own understanding. Acknowledge him, and he'll direct the way you should go.
Great, thank you. All right, moving on. Proverbs 3. Down at verse 25, have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being snared. Now, that sounds like a promise, but we know that sometimes there is disaster that hits us suddenly for reasons we don't understand, just like it hit Job. So what do we make of that? Are we to believe that or not?
How do you believe it? I mean, there are lots of things. We have people in this church whose fathers have fallen over in the bathroom and broken their necks and died. In the middle of the night when they were young.
Right.
We've had people who've lost kids. It's awful hard to say that God is always going to make things right.
No, but God helps you to get through
That's
those
true.
disasters.
If you trust in
If
God,
you trust in God,
if you trust in God,
he will help you through
right.
those
Yeah.
things that happen.
I think perhaps the key to this is to back up to verse 21, where it says, my son, preserve sound judgment and discernment. Do not let them out of your sight. et cetera, et cetera. What, again, I think this goes to not a promise, but a probability. So if you live a life where you exercise sound judgment and discernment, and you try to live the right way in a good and godly fashion, you can potentially minimize the possibility of sudden disaster coming upon you. That's not to say that it won't.
Or another
It
way
might
of saying it,
anyway.
you are more likely to avoid disaster than if you behave the other way.
Yes.
Right. If it's self-inflicted disaster.
Right.
Chapter 5, then we start warning against adultery. And adultery seems to be a big, heavy topic here in
It's
the
a big
first nine Proverbs. But you know, if you think, okay, who is he writing to? He's writing here to young men. I mean, early on, we didn't talk about it, but there's sections in there about avoiding violence. Don't go off with people who are bloodthirsty and want you to join in with them and have fun. Now here it's talking about avoiding adultery.
But they had many wives. This is really not adultery. This is sex out of wedlock, I think. isn't
That's,
it?
well, it's not
Well, that's
adultery
what
if you're married
adultery
to
is.
multiple wives. Polygamy is not adultery.
It is to me.
Okay,
I think
you're-
adultery
you're-
is having,
You're here, they're there.
I mean, nowadays it would be
And
considered that.
I'll give you a piece about one of the reasons that the 10th commandment talks about thou shalt not commit adultery. Is adultery torpedoed the community. If you are having sex with somebody else's wife, and if we want to go right there, his property, you are abusing his property, you are disrupting the community. And so rather than sexual habit, it ties mostly to the disruptive effect of breaking into somebody else's house and abusing.
Well, you look at the consequences of David's affair with Bathsheba.
Absolutely.
I mean, that everything went south after that. It really
Absolutely.
did.
Right.
So, yet David had a harem,
Yeah, he
as did
did.
Solomon. So,
A big here.
you know, I can't reconcile,
I can't
honestly.
either.
The whole issue of polygamy is something in the Old Testament.
It's very different.
Well, that was
But
just
yet,
the
look,
way
but yet,
Many were slaves too.
look at this in here, the same Proverbs 5,
So, I don't know.
verse 18. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife, singular, the
Of your
wife
youth.
of your youth. A loving doe, a graceful deer, may her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. That's right out of Song of Solomon, that language,
Yeah, that's what it
Directly.
sounds like.
out of Song
But
of
that's
Solomon.
more like one wife.
Or your first wife. We do not understand that, maybe the Mormons do, I don't know, but we do not understand that concept. of
Yes,
having-
But
that's
even in
bad.
Saudi Arabia and other places, Muslim places, they have more than one. wife.
Right, but why is the first wife more sacrosanct? then?
Because,
Because
I don't
she
know,
is the first.
I don't know. And then Karen's right about slaves, because when you get
They
down
were slave
to
wives.
Jacob, he had 2 wives and 2 quote servants, the same word for slaves,
Mhm.
that bore children
Yeah.
that were the mothers of some of the tribes of Israel.
So, yeah,
Well, Solomon was said to have, in the Bible, it says he had 300 wives,
Oh,
you
give
can
me one.
imagine that,
No.
and 700 concubines.
no, oh, right.
Wow. He had a lot of women,
I don't
let's
think
face
so.
it.
That's because.
And that was a part of his downfall too, because he
You
gave
weren't
in to
very
them
wise to have
and
that many
built
women around. there.
idols to their gods. They had come from foreign lands and he allowed them to build gods.
Oh,
And that's just,
so
When he made contracts with foreign lands or
Right.
he took
or
wives.
foreign tribes, he was given a wife. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that he cohabitated with that wife.
This is
She
not about
was in
sex.
the harem.
This is not about sex. This
No,
is about
this is
politics.
about property.
Oh, don't give me a break. What?
It
Well,
is.
that's the way it was.
You can't.
All right.
You cannot
It's
evaluate.
ridiculous. And he couldn't keep up with that many women, whether they would all be,
I don't know who could.
I have trouble
Whatever.
with one.
Thousands of years ago.
I know it was, and those women were dumb.
All right, we gotta move on in the interest of time.
As
Dumber
Star
than
Wars
dirt.
says, as Star Wars says, it's long ago and far away.
Yeah, it's so much weirder than it is today. I'm sorry, I'm in a mood tonight.
That's
Steve.
good. No, that's good.
No, that's not good.
One thing I forgot to raise, pardon me, one thing I forgot to raise on this whole gender thing, we get back to backpedal here for a minute. Chapter 1, verse 20.
Sons, yeah.
The author gives wisdom femininity. Wisdom is referred to
Yes,
as
she.
she.
Ah,
So
there
as
we go.
patriarchal as it seems, the good quality, wisdom is feminine. Right?
It always, the Jewish faith always labeled her as Sophia, which is the feminine version of wisdom.
Right.
And that's,
Which one?
All right, chapter 6, verse 16, 17, 18, 19 seems to be something that we ought to be aware of. 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him.
Boy,
Now, this 6 things and then 7 things, this is sort of a style of writing that we're going to see later in the chapter that was written by Agur, I believe. And my reading indicated that the reason they would say, for example, 6 things, but 7 that are, is to give great weight to the 7. Right? Because you're went, oh, 7, what's the 7? You know, and that would get you focused. So anyway, what are they? Haughty eyes or arrogance, a lying tongue, so deceit, hands that shed innocent blood, so violent people, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, false witness, a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. Well, as we were talking earlier, there was a lot of dissension among brothers back in the day, so it makes sense that that would
and
be a
in
problem.
fact, the God's habit of picking the younger brother generated dissension.
oh, yeah.
Mm.
David, the shepherd boy over all the other.
Well, and Esau and Jacob, but there's time and time again, he favors the younger.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And then there are the seven
Deadly sins.
which, we could read. I would read it, but I can't.
Well, it's a very Catholic vision.
But,
Yeah.
but it corresponds a lot with
It does.
the things that, these are the things the Lord despises.
We go to chapter 7, another warning against the adulteress, as if the preceding chapter was not enough. We have to go back and we have to talk about it again in very strong
yeah.
language. So let's pass over that and keep moving.
Evil
But
women.
one of the things they talk about here is not just adultery, they talk about prostitutes,
Yeah, yeah.
which doesn't necessarily mean that the young man, it's
For
more
smooth talk.
fornication than adultery.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Then we get chapter 9, invitations of wisdom and folly. But then this sort of bursts our bubble. I said, that wisdom had a feminine image here. But if you look at verse 13, the woman folly is loud, undisciplined, without knowledge, etc., etc.,
And
etc.
no shame.
So now folly has a feminine gender as well. I mean, what are you going to
It's
do?
like hurricanes, I
Well,
guess.
My translation calls it, says, the foolish woman is restless and noisy, which doesn't really name being foolish. It classifies this particular type of woman as being foolish.
Mhm. You have the wrong translation, by the way. This is the way.
When you get to the red print, that's a discussion.
Okay, so that's kind of the prologue. We need to keep moving along here, so I'm going to jump back into, let's see,
You can tell us all.
No, you can't.
chapters 10 to 22. All right, what do we got in here? There are different topics that come out in here. That there are a number of proverbs that pertain to these topics. One of them, good thing, is gray hair. Gray hair is said
I
to be
quoted
a
that to
good
her
thing.
3 times.
Oh,
Your hair is white.
Sorry. I cover mine up.
So it's yours.
No, mine's gray.
Yours is more white than gray, I think Steve says, Peter.
But there, I actually found the verse you cited, I actually found another one too. It's chapter 20, verse 29. I don't know what, but it, so basically it's respect for older people. Older people have wisdom. So respect them, right? Respect them for their wisdom. Isn't that a novel?
Don't forget it.
There are verses here, a lot of verses that talk about wealth, poverty, and caring for the poor. There are really, really, really a lot of verses here about caring for the poor. And, that's very consistent with Jesus in his message in the New Testament, right? The poor, the
Widows and
downtrodden.
orphans.
It is, but Jesus's tone, as is this one, is more that if you have wealth, you are obligated to share with the poor. I'm looking here at chapter 10.
Mhm.
It says the wages of the rich man's wealth is his fortress. The ruin of the poor is their poverty. And as you go through, there are other ones that say, if you don't share it, you're not doing the right thing. And that's a very Christian message.
Mhm.
And it went through the Jewish religion also, the need to care for the poor and the widows and orphans. Remember in the
Harder for
New
rich
Testament,
man to
when
go
they were
through the eye of a needle.
talking about who is going to care for the widows and orphans.
Well, it says in chapter 17, he who mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. Children's children are a crown to the aged, and parents are the pride of their children. We go on to verse 17. This one this was a bit of a speed bump for me. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity.
Huh,
Right?
nice.
Competition for the father's inheritance, or the mother's love.
Again, appropriate for that particular time, perhaps.
And we see it in the Bible over and over.
I mean, it's still happening.
Starting in Genesis with Cain and Abel.
Happens somewhat today, but not the way it did back then. Maybe in like very rich or kingly places where they're really going to inherit a big thing or be the king rather than the prince. I mean, look at the princes in England kind of thing. Anyway,
Couldn't,
But there is some of that.
since these are essentially self-contained, well, couldn't you look at it another way? Again, Steve?
Go ahead.
No, the part about the brother, born for
Oh.
adversity.
Brother is born for adversity.
Could you look at that in the context of when you have adversity, your family's gonna be there?
Your family's gonna what?
oh, a brother is born to support you in adversity more than, okay,
a good
than to
point.
be adverse to you. That's a positive spin, yeah.
There is, but there's another verse in here. I don't have it written down. I can't tell you what number it is, but it says the essence of it is, if you are in need, don't go to your brother, go to your neighbor.
Now,
Right.
your brother might be a long way off, where your neighbor is
Yes.
right next door, right?
We're
Maybe.
trying to make it sound better,
Maybe,
but I don't
maybe.
know that that's what they meant. I think they
Yeah.
might have meant that there was a lot of.
These
with
are all
brothers.
open to interpretation.
There are.
And we always interpret them from the point of view of 2021.
Right, right, and it's hard to see back then.
Yes, and in one of my translations, and I don't know which one, I thought it was in this Bible, but I couldn't find it. That a friend loves at all times, even though he knows your faults.
Okay.
I like
Right.
that.
Chapter 19. Oh, go ahead.
No, I like that interpretation of that.
Okay, all right. So chapter 19 has got a number of interesting things in here, I think. You look at chapter 19, verse 13. A foolish son is his father's ruin, and a quarrelsome wife is like a constant ripping.
Boy, is that
Ooh.
true.
There are several references throughout here to quarrelsome wives. Now,
Yes.
if Solomon had 300 wives,
You know they fought.
maybe that's why it's in here.
The translation of a foolish son, mine has an alternative translation of an ungodly son.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Going down just a little bit, and these are all scattershot. Like I said, they're not tied together. Everyone's got a different topic here. But so verse 15, laziness brings on deep sleep and the shiftless man goes hungry.
Oh, I should be lazy and sleep better.
This is a theme that is also comes through here quite a bit. It's also consistent with what the Apostle Paul said too, about the value of work. And when he said, who does not work will not
Will
eat.
not eat, right?
Just simple statement. And I was struck going through Proverbs at how many Proverbs there are, just basically saying the same thing, that, the value of work.
Even though you take care of the poor, you encourage them to work, I suppose, if
I
they
guess.
can.
The issue
Good
here
point.
for all of them was this was a hand-to-mouth
It
society.
was, yeah.
for the most part, people were, if you didn't work, you didn't eat.
Yeah, there was a lot.
It's interesting that the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. That was his craft, and he worked with his hands. We think of him as just being an evangelist essentially, but he worked, I think, through the whole time of his ministry, if I'm not mistaken.
And he converted people through his work.
So, all right, the value of work. Down to verse 17, he who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward him for what he has done. Next down, 18, discipline your son, for in that there is hope. Do not be a willing party to his death. There's a lot about disciplining young men in here, and it talks specifically about beating them with a rod
Oh, nice.
in a couple of cases, right? Which
Spare the
again,
rod
ancient
and
times,
spoil the
but that's where it
child.
comes from.
If we go back to Leviticus, one of the most troublesome rules
Oh,
is that
yes.
a rebellious son should be stoned.
Stoned to death.
I mean, that's one of the 613 that you look
Yeah.
at and you go, I don't think so.
That's a little harsh. Maybe ground them for a while.
And then verse 20, listen to advice and accept instruction, and in the end, you will be wise. It's a counter to arrogance, isn't it? Listen to other people. Listen to what they have to tell you. That also runs, I'm not just saying these as individual proverbs, but these proverbs seem to be thematic throughout the book of Proverbs here. Just listening to other people. It goes to getting along. In chapter 20, verse 1, wine is a mocker, beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. So it doesn't say you shouldn't drink, but don't be led astray by them. That's how I like to interpret it. Jesus changed water into wine. Okay. 17. See what I've got written down. Just bear with me a second. I got all these random verses written
Yeah,
down.
so you're
here.
back at 17.
17. Okay, 17:14 and 17:19.
Okay, there's Gail.
Starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, so drop the matter before a dispute breaks out. And then down to 19, he who loves a quarrel loves sin. He who builds a high gate invites destruction. So again, there's throughout Proverbs, there's the theme of peace, trying to find peace, avoiding quarreling and dissension, listening to people, not being arrogant. While I'm there, chapter 18:22, he who finds a wife, singular, finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord. Okay. All right, so then we get into the sayings of the wise. These are chapters 22 to 24. It's a little bit of a change of source and style. It's a fatherly approach again, warm, personal, do's and do nots, sort of like a teaching manual. And it discusses, again, avoiding seeking riches. It talks about punishing a child in there. Let me see if that's the verse that I was thinking. 23. Yes. 23, 13, and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he will not die. Punish him with the rod and save his soul from death. Another theme against indulgence in verse 20. Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags.
Should have had that in college.
Okay.
Do not despise your mother when she is old.
More support for the needy.
Did you find that one?
I did.
Do not support,
23, hearken to your father who begat you, and do not despise your mother when she is old.
Yeah.
I'll tell my sons that.
There are a number of verses in there that do show respect for
Yeah.
mothers in particular, and
And for
listening to the mother, the wisdom of the mother as well as the father. I think that's clear throughout there. And then in 23, he starts with 29 to 35. Boy, there's a real challenge not to drink too much.
That's another issue that has come up, especially in Methodism. Because Methodism, like baptism, at one time, people did not drink.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't go to a Methodist party today without seeing wine and beer.
Except in the
Well, except in the church.
I know.
I one time suggested we have wine and something in church, and I was met with a gasp.
Yeah, no,
But if.
I
but if
have
you-
to say, Pia, who is Baptist, was in a group with some women, and I don't remember early on when she came to the Methodist church with us, and she was very surprised at how many Methodists. She said, "You all drink, really?" She was very
I
surprised,
mean, that-
because I went to Baptist college, and there was no drinking at all,
yeah,
Anyway.
well, that's what they said.
not on campus.
All right, we've only got like 10 minutes left, so we gotta step on the accelerator here a little bit. I feel like there's so much that we're just not gonna get into tonight, but we'll try to hit some of the high points. More Proverbs of Solomon in chapter 25, verse 21. I think this is very consistent with what Jesus would say. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. So my young son, when he was about 5 or 6, somehow we were talking about the Bible and this verse came up. Heard it, sort of squinted and said, so that means you can get back at him, but in a nice way.
Oh, there you go, out of the mouths of babes.
That's kind of what it's saying. Yeah, right. Yeah, so let's see, this is the section was compiled under the rule of Hezekiah. Treatment of enemies, once subject discussion about fools. Okay, 26:4 and 26:5. These are the classic proverbs that contradict each other. I'm sorry, yeah, 4 and
Yeah,
5.
they
So
do
26:4 and 5. 4, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him yourself. But then 5 says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes.
So which is which?
It depends on the situation.
Yes.
That's the answer. It
Yes.
depends on the situation. It's kind of odd that they would come back to back like that, but maybe that was intentional, so people would trip over them like we did and have to think about it a little bit.
Reminds me of a lawyer who was giving a class, and he said, you can always answer one question when asked is it legal? It depends.
All right, Sayings of Agur, chapter 30. Agur, son of Jakeh, an oracle, declared to Ithiel and to Ukal. Okay, whatever. Let's see, what do we have in here? Musings on the Creator and the ways of his creatures. It starts off with in chapter 30 there, verses 1 to 4. It sounds almost like it was lifted up out of Job, right? Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Who has gathered up the wind? Who has wrapped up the waters? Who has established all the ends of the earth? I mean, there's a certain relationship of these books to each other, I think, as you go through it. And then we get into more of the so-called numerical proverbs. This is the one chapter of Proverb where it says, 3 things that are never satisfied, 4 that never say enough. 4 things on earth are small, yet they're extremely wise. 3 things, 4 things, 4 things, 5 things, et cetera, et cetera. So again, that's just a style of writing, which I think was intentional in order to bring emphasis to the thing that, the 5th thing, if they mention 4 things. So you think about it, you focus on it a little bit. Like in the Psalms, the repetition, had a purpose there. Repetition, repeat things over and over. The term Selah in there would be like a break, for a musical break in the psalm, intended for people to have to stop and think about what was just recited in the psalm, or what was just sung. Almost done. So we get then into 31, the sayings of King Lemuel. This is a very short chapter before the epilogue, and it's not clear to me who wrote the epilogue, whether that's also King Lemuel or somebody else. I don't think we necessarily know. But 31 sayings of King Lemuel, this is guidance that his mother, the queen mother, is giving him on how to rule. And there we go again. Do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. Not for kings to drink wine or rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what the law decrees, etc., etc. But then it turns around and says, give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. So if you're a king, not a good idea because you got to rule, but the poor people out there, I'll let them.
Drunks are easier to rule.
Maybe.
And then the last one here, the epilogue, the wife of noble character. So again, remember, this is being addressed to young men, and we've had some comments about wives being quarrelsome and so forth, and the value of finding a good wife. And this sort of wraps it all up here, the wife of noble character. And it describes her in a very, very traditional way, where she is a mother, a homemaker. She cares for her family, she cares for her husband. Says she opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. Again, that theme of being good to the poor that runs over and over throughout the whole Proverbs. And then it closes, it says in verse 30, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. So, book of Proverbs, we've only touched the surface. I mean, there's so many more in there that are interesting, and some I wanted to point out, but we don't really have time. Any concluding thoughts about the Proverbs? What do we take away from all this in terms of the theology of the modern Christian church today? What does it tell us that we can apply, if anything? Zoomers, any ideas?
Yeah, they're all asleep out there.
No, they're not.
They're watching football.
Not true, not true.
Not true at all.
Okay, let's hear what you have to say.
To me, it's just, you said before that it was kind of a how to live your life, but it also just seems to be other ways to underscore the 10 Commandments.
Which is how to live.
Yeah.
your life. Yeah,
Right.
true.
It's pretty basic. I mean, the lessons that are in here, some of them we can look at and we say, yeah, that was back then, beating the child with a rod or whatever, God, you go to jail today, rightly so. But I would say that most of the Proverbs that are in there today, most of them are still applicable. Were written 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, so some of them need a little bit of interpretation. You don't beat your child with a rod, but you discipline a child.
Right, exactly.
Or you use a wooden spoon.
Or a ruler.
All right. Where do we deviate from the Proverbs in modern society today? It's a loaded question, I know.
It is.
Are we living by what we see here in the Proverbs or not, do you think?
It's impossible to live by everything in Proverbs. You pointed out the construction, the contradictions. There are arcane references that are no longer apply.
But the good.
If you use as a general guide, but to say I live by them would be very difficult.
Anybody else?
Well, I think what you talked about at the beginning, today we consider more equity in our relationships between the genders, where this was clearly in a different time, a patriarchal time and a time of primogeniture and women being chattel. So it just doesn't compare in that way.
But yet it still talks about respecting women and, taking care of other people, and particularly poor people, or, you know, people who work for you, whether they be slaves or your wife or whatever. You know, you take care of other people and have compassion for other people.
What about honoring and respecting the old? Society doesn't do that as much.
No, we don't.
We look more to.
Some cultures do.
Some do, more the Asian
Yep.
cultures than ours.
And in Native American,
Yes,
almost. in
but I
Indian,
think ours look
apologize.
more to youth as being the, anyway.
I was just thinking about some of the problems that we have today. I mean, they're the same problems that they had back then, I think. Lacking fear of God, self over community, sexual immorality, wealth to excess, neglect of the poor, undisciplined youth,
Abuse of alcohol.
abuse of alcohol, lack of respect for wisdom of parents and elders, arrogance, laziness, and sloth, lack of personal responsibility. Nothing has changed in 3,000 years.
That's really sad.
Has it gotten
isn't it?
better or worse? I don't
I
know.
don't know. We
You'd
go-
like to think if
like
people
it's
have been reading the Proverbs for 3,000 years, it'd be
Steps
getting
forward,
better,
3
but
steps back. It's
maybe
just-
not.
I don't know. It's mankind.
Okay,
It's our sinful human nature.
There's some of that too.
I'll put all this in a context, in a current political context, or maybe any political context, and you know, you just see all where it doesn't fit or where it hasn't been followed, rather.
right, absolutely. All right, so let me see. Here's a summary that I took away from one book. Life is seldom as unclouded or predictable as here in Proverbs. But here are the disciplined qualities and habits that make for stability and that work with the grain in God's world. Only fools undervalue them. There is room in God's will for the unexpected and unexplained, but we do not have to be paralyzed by such uncertainties or despise the built-in regularities. Proverbs insists that we take seriously, sensibly, confidently, and from the hand of God. All right. Okay, so we're going to take a break now until December the 5th, I think, right? December the 5th. So the next 2 Sundays around Thanksgiving week, we will not have class, but we're going to come back and pick up with another tough one, Ecclesiastes. And then December 12th, we'll do Song of Solomon, and that will complete the Wisdom Book series. Do we have any prayer requests as we conclude here tonight?
Dan Clayton's father. He's been admitted back to the hospital in emergency room again.
Yes, Sally Sutton and Kay Packard, having lost her husband, Mike. 2 of them. And Sally, recently moved into a more assisted care part of Green
I
Spring.
just talked to her for a few minutes this afternoon, not very long, but she sounded good. And she said she made the choice because she felt she'd have more care there. And if she needed someone, they'd be available. So it sounded like a positive move for her.
She's well aware of her declining health. She's very realistic, but still very upbeat about everything.
Sounds like it.
She's quite a gal.
Yeah, I would like to ask you all to pray for a member of my extended family. His name is Mike Sullivan. He's in intensive care right now, not expected to make it. He's had 2 strokes, lung cancer, all came on very suddenly just over the past year. He was a marathon runner, healthy as could be, and just the nicest, most generous human being I've ever met. But his family is with him right now, wife and children. His name is Mike Sullivan, his wife's name is Ann. Really use prayers. Okay, any more?
I think Gordon and June Lancaster.
Who, sorry?
Gordon and June Lancaster.
I just talked to him for a few minutes because I dropped dinner off to him. Is his wife in rehab, the hospital, assisted living, what?
She is in Cherrydale.
Which is,
It's a like a rehab,
Okay,
but
is it a permanent thing?
I don't think she'll come home again. Because just a couple of days ago, she had another stroke. And it's very sad because they have no children.
Oh, really?
You know,
Oh, wow.
getting the two being able to be together is just
Oh.
heartbreaking.
They live right next to Peter.
Yeah, right next to.
Right.
All right, let me go ahead and close this in prayer then. Dear Lord, thank you for being with us tonight as we work through the book of Proverbs. We pray that we have learned some things that you want us to learn, to know, internalize, and we can share them with others. As we close, Lord, we remember those who are in need of your blessing, of your help. Dan Clayton, his father, Sally Sutton, Kay Packard, Mike and Ann Sullivan, Gordon and Julie Lancaster, and Catherine, the lady who had the issue in church today. Lord, we just ask that you wrap your arms around each one of these people and others who we hold in our hearts, praying for your blessing, your peace, your healing. We give thanks to you, praise to you, O God, for all of our mighty blessings. We thank you for this church and all the members of this church and for each other, for our pastors. We pray you will be with us now and forever. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Nicely done.
Thank you. See you in a few weeks.
Thanksgiving.
Steve,
Good.
Steve, you mentioned somebody, I didn't catch who you said something happened in church today
Yes.
There was
with someone?
an older lady who, I don't know if she
Well,
fainted or what, in the back pew.
I think she passed out. Apparently, she's been coming for a few weeks. Her daughter is Rachel McGee's running partner. Her daughter-in-law is, no, wait a minute. Yeah, her daughter-in-law is Rachel McGee's running partner. I don't know the lady or her daughter-in-law. I was back
Okay.
there and talked to Rachel for a minute, Rachel McGee.
Her name is Catherine, and they called 911
They did.
to come to the church in the middle of the 11:15 service.
Oh, okay.
But she was able
Okay.
actually to, well, at first to walk out on her own, and then she was taken away in ambulance, and I have no information what's
Yeah, I
come
don't know
since.
either.
All I know is her name's Catherine. I don't even know her last name.
I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you bet. All right,
Well,
thanks again, everybody. Have a
Two of
great
the nurses
Thanksgiving.
were there, Lois.
Bye.
Kathy
Bye-bye,
Wilson
all.
and Patty O'Neill were there.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Bye.
You bet. See you.
See you ladies in the morning.